The year was 1881, and the world for Arthur Prescott had shrunk to the size of his failing homestead. It was a patch of unforgiving land carved out of the vast, silent plains of Wyoming, a place where the wind was the only constant companion, and the sky was a canvas for loneliness. The earth was stingy, offering up rocks and dust more readily than it did crops, and the small herd of cattle he'd brought with him had been whittled down by harsh winters and his own inexperience. He was a man hollowed out by loss, the echoes of his wife Martha's laughter and the phantom weight of his infant son in his arms still haunting the corners of his small, sturdy cabin. Grief, he had learned, was a physical thing. It had weight and texture. It was the permanent ache in his chest, the dullness in his eyes when he caught his reflection in the window pane, the way his hands, once gentle, had become clumsy and hard. He moved through his days in a fog of routine, a ritual of survival that kept the deeper despair at bay. Chop wood, mend the fence, check the snares, boil the coffee. The silence of the cabin was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was a silence he had once shared with Martha, a comfortable quiet filled with unspoken understanding. Now, it was just empty. The nearby town of Redemption was a place he avoided whenever possible. It was a raw, dusty collection of clapboard buildings populated by people whose faces were etched with suspicion and judgment. They saw him as a failure, a man who couldn't keep his wife alive, who lived on the edge of decency and civilization, too close to the lands the Lakota considered their own. Their pity was sharper than their scorn, so he went only for salt, flour, and bullets, his answers to their prodding questions as short and hard as the winter ground. He was an outsider by circumstance, and had become one by choice, wrapping his isolation around himself like a threadbare coat against a biting wind. He held the same prejudice for the Lakota that the townsfolk held for him. He saw them as a distant threat, a shadowy otherness that represented the wildness he was trying to tame, both on his land and within himself. He'd hear stories in town of raids and skirmishes, whispers that fed the fear and mistrust that was the common currency of the frontier. He had never had a direct confrontation, only catching glimpses of them from afaradas on the horizon, silhouettes against the setting sun, as remote and unknowable as the stars. They were part of the landscape's harshness, another danger to be watched for, another reason the rifle was always leaning by the door. His life was a long, slow exhale, a waiting for an end he was too stubborn to seek himself. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was too tired for memory. He ate without tasting, slept without resting, and woke each morning to the same crushing weight of a day to be endured. This was his stasis, a desolate equilibrium built on the foundations of what he had lost. It was on a blistering afternoon in late summer that the equilibrium shattered. He was tracking a stray heifer, a foolish animal that had a talent for finding the weakest point in his fence line. The sun beat down on the back of his neck, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and dry grass. He followed the tracks into a shallow ravine, a place of crumbling rock and stunted, thorny bushes. The silence here was different, not empty, but watchful. The air felt taut, like a wire pulled tight. He heard at first a sharp cry, not of an animal but of a child. It was cut short, followed by the guttural laugh of a man. Arthur froze, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He crept forward, using the rocks for cover, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He peered over a sandstone ledge, and the scene below sent a jolt through his weary soul. A boy, no older than 9 or 10, was backed against a rock wall. He was Lakota, his dark hair long, his face a mask of terror and defiance. He held a small, crudely made knife, but it was no match for the two men advancing on him. They were white men, their faces coarse and unshaven, their clothes grimy with trail dust. They were not settlers, they were scavengers, the kind of men who preyed on the weak, their eyes glinting with a casual cruelty. A third man stood by their horses, holding a bow, an unusual weapon for a white man, likely stolen. "Look what we got here," one of the men sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A little stray. Wonder what the chief would pay to get his boy back." The other man laughed. "Ain't gonna be nothing left to pay for by the time we're done." Arthur's mind raced. This was not his fight. This was the trouble he had spent years avoiding. The boy was Lakota. His people were the specters on the horizon, the whispered threat. To interfere was to invite a world of pain, to kick a hornet's nest that could consume him and his small, fragile existence entirely. The smart thing, the sensible thing, was to back away slowly, to pretend he had seen nothing, to let the brutal calculus of the frontier play out. But then he saw the boy's eyes, wide with fear, yes, but also filled with a fierce, desperate courage that reminded him of someone else. Of Martha, facing her final sickness with a strength that had humbled him. In that instant, the boy ceased to be an abstract threat, a faceless native. He was just a child, cornered and alone. The hollow space inside Arthur, the part of him that had died with his family, ached with a sudden, sharp agony. To turn away now would not be survival. It would be a betrayal of the man he once was, the man Martha had loved. With a curse that was half prayer, half resignation, Arthur drew his pistol. He didn't issue a warning. Men like this didn't deserve one. He aimed for the first man, the one closest to the boy, and fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the ravine walls, a deafening intrusion into the tense silence. The man grunted, stumbling back with a look of pure shock, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. The second man reacted instantly, spinning around and drawing his own weapon. Arthur fired again, the bullet kicking up dust near the man's feet, forcing him to dive for cover. The boy, Chaitan, seized the moment of chaos. He darted sideways, scrambling up the rock face with the agility of a mountain cat. "Get him!" the wounded outlaw roared, his face contorted in pain and rage. The third man, the one with the bow, had already nocked an arrow. He was quick. The bowstring twanged, and Arthur felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder, just below the collarbone. The force of it staggered him. He gritted his teeth, the world narrowing to a pinprick of agony. He raised his Colt again, his arm trembling, and fired at the archer. The shot went wide. He had to get to the boy. He shoved himself away from the rock, ignoring the fire spreading through his shoulder. He scrambled towards Chaitan, who was now halfway up the side of the ravine. "Come on," he yelled, the words torn from his throat. Another arrow flew. This one struck him square in the back, just to the right of his spine. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent him sprawling forward onto the dusty ground. A wave of nausea and blackness washed over him. He fought it, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. He could hear the men shouting, advancing. He was a dead man. But Chaitan had not fled. He had stopped, looking down at Arthur with an expression that was no longer just fear. He scrambled back down a few feet, picked up a heavy rock, and hurled it with all his might. It struck the second outlaw in the side of the head. The man cried out and dropped to one knee, dazed. The act of courage, so small and so profound, gave Arthur a final surge of strength. He roared, a sound of pure, primal fury, and pushed himself to his feet. He lunged toward the wounded archer, using his body as a shield for the boy, and brought the heavy barrel of his pistol down on the man's head. The man collapsed in a heap. The first outlaw, his arm useless, looked from his downed companions to the wild-eyed, bleeding man in front of him. He saw the dying light in Arthur's eyes and knew it was the most dangerous kind. He backed away, turned, and fled, scrambling to his horse and riding off without a backward glance. Silence descended once more, broken only by Arthur's ragged, painful breaths and the groans of the outlaw Chaitan had hit. Arthur swayed on his feet. He looked at the boy, who was staring at him, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. Arthur tried to give him a reassuring nod, but the world was tilting violently. The archer stirred. Arthur knew he couldn't leave him there. He had to get the boy away. He gestured frantically with his good arm. "Go, run." He turned his back to the remaining threat, a deliberate act of protection, and started to half-drag, half-push Chaitan up and out of the ravine. That was when the third arrow hit. It struck him low in the back, near the first one, a sickening crunch of bone and sinew. The pain was absolute, a white oblivion that consumed everything. His legs gave out. He fell, his last conscious thought a silent apology to Martha for failing, yet again. He didn't know how long he was out. When consciousness returned, it was in fragmented shards of agony. He was being moved. Small hands were pulling at his shirt, trying to drag him. He opened his eyes and saw Chaitan, his face streaked with dirt and tears, straining to pull him by the arm. The boy was trying to save him. The absurdity of it, the sheer, impossible grit of the child, sparked something deep inside Arthur. He couldn't die here. He couldn't leave this boy alone with those men who might come back. He forced his body to respond, his muscles screaming in protest. He got his arms under him, then one leg. The world was a spinning vortex of pain, the shafts of the arrows in his back grinding with every movement. "My cabin," he gasped, the words tasting of blood and dust. He pointed vaguely in the direction of his homestead. The journey was a nightmare, a timeless, hallucinatory crawl through a landscape of torment. Chaitan stayed with him, a small, silent presence, sometimes pulling, sometimes pushing, his small hands surprisingly strong. He became Arthur's anchor, the one point of focus in a sea of pain. They moved yard by agonizing yard, Arthur lurching and falling, Chaitan helping him up, their shared ordeal forging a bond stronger than any words. By the time they stumbled into the clearing where his cabin stood, the sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon, and the sky was bruised into nightfall. Arthur collapsed just inside the doorway, the rough-hewn floorboards cool against his feverish cheek. The last of his strength was gone. He was a vessel filled only with pain. He could feel the hot, sticky wetness of blood soaking his back, the unnatural pressure of the arrow shafts against his insides. He drifted in and out of a delirious haze. Time became meaningless. He was dimly aware of the boy moving about the small cabin. He heard the scrape of the water bucket, felt a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. It was an act of such simple, profound kindness that it brought tears to his eyes. He tried to speak, to thank him, but only a dry croak emerged. Later, he felt a blanket being draped over him, tucked in with a care that was achingly familiar. In his fevered mind, the small, dark-haired boy became his own son, grown and returned to him. He saw Martha's face in the shadows, her expression soft with concern. The ghosts that usually tormented him were now figures of comfort, beckoning him toward a peaceful darkness. He was dying, he realized, and a strange sense of calm settled over him. He had not died alone in his empty house. He had died saving a life. It was a better end than he deserved. He let the darkness take him, surrendering to the inevitable. A sound pulled him from the depths, not the gentle sounds of the cabin, but a low, rhythmic thrumming. It was the sound of many horses, moving at a walk, their hooves muffled by the dusty earth. For a moment, he thought the outlaws had returned with reinforcements. A cold dread, sharper than the pain in his back, cut through his fever. He forced his eyes open. Pale morning light filtered through the single grime-caked window. The cabin was filled with a strange, ambient glow. He tried to push himself up, to reach the rifle that was still leaning against the wall, a lifetime away. A fresh wave of agony shot through him, and he fell back with a groan. Chaitan was at the window, peering through a small crack in the frame. The boy's body was rigid with tension. He turned to look at Arthur, his eyes wide, but this time it wasn't fear for himself. It was fear for Arthur. Arthur strained to listen. The thrumming had stopped. Now there was only silence, a heavy, expectant quiet that was more terrifying than any noise. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who was outside. It wasn't the outlaws. He managed to twist his head, ignoring the grinding protest from his back, and looked through the open doorway. His house was surrounded. Warriors on horseback formed a loose, silent circle around the cabin, their figures stark against the pale dawn. They were Lakota. They sat motionless on their ponies, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on his small, vulnerable home. Spears and bows were held at the ready. They were not here for a social call. This was it, the culmination of all his fears. They had found the boy here, with him, a wounded white man. They would see the blood, the state he was in, and assume the worst. They would believe he had kidnapped him, harmed him. His act of salvation would be seen as an act of war. The irony was so bitter, it felt like poison in his throat. He had saved the chief's son only to be killed by the chief. He closed his eyes, a profound weariness settling over him. He had no strength to fight, no voice to explain. He could only lie on his floor and wait for the end he had cheated the day before. He heard the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of moccasins on the ground. They were dismounting. They were coming for him. The cabin door was pushed open wider. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood silhouetted against the morning light. He wore the eagle feather headdress of a chief, his face a stern, unreadable mask of authority. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept the room, taking in the scene with a chilling swiftness: the overturned stool, the bloodstains on the floor, the pale, broken man lying there, and finally, his son, standing protectively near the wounded man's head. This was the chief. This was Tashunka. Arthur braced himself for the killing blow. He met the chief's gaze, determined to show no fear, to hold on to this last shred of dignity. He had nothing left to lose. But the expected war cry never came. Instead, Chaitan ran forward, not away from Arthur, but toward his father. He spoke in a torrent of rapid Lakota, his voice high and urgent. He pointed at Arthur, then gestured wildly toward the ravine, mimicking the act of shooting a bow, the fall of a man. He pointed to the arrows still embedded in Arthur's back, his small hands tracing their trajectory. He then pointed to himself, tapped his chest, and made a gesture of safety, of protection. He ran back to Arthur's side, placing a small hand on his uninjured shoulder, looking up at his father with a look of desperate appeal. Tashunka's stern expression did not change, but a flicker of something, confusion perhaps, or re-evaluation, passed through his eyes. He took a step into the cabin, his movements deliberate and silent. 2 other warriors followed him in. He knelt beside Arthur, his gaze falling on the arrow shafts protruding from his back. The townsfolk and most settlers used rifles. Bows were the weapons of the tribes. But a warrior knew his own make, and he knew the make of his enemies. The chief reached out a hand, not to harm, but to examine. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against the fletching of the highest arrow. He studied the distinctive black and white feathers, the way they were bound with sinew. His eyes narrowed. These were not Lakota arrows. They were not Cheyenne or Crow. They belonged to a small band of renegades, white men and dispossessed natives who plagued native and settler alike, known for their particular brand of brutal scavenging. He looked from the arrows to his son, and then back to the pale, sweat-soaked face of the man on the floor. He saw not an aggressor, but a shield. The placement of the wounds, all in the back, told a clear story. This man had turned his back to the danger to protect the boy. He had taken the arrows meant for his son. Understanding dawned, slow and profound. The entire narrative he had prepared for of abduction, of violence, of righteous retribution crumbled into dust. What he saw was not a crime, but a sacrifice. An incomprehensible act of courage from a man he would have considered an enemy. Tashunka stood up. The silence in the cabin was so thick, Arthur could feel its weight pressing down on him. The chief turned and spoke a few quiet words in his language to the warriors behind him. One of them immediately turned and left the cabin, moving with purpose. Then Tashunka looked at Arthur. For the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by something Arthur could not name. It was not pity. It was something deeper, a form of acknowledgement, of respect. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive. It was a gesture of debt. Arthur's world began to swim again, the edges blurring into grey. The relief was so immense, so unexpected, that it broke the last of his tenuous hold on consciousness. As he slipped back into the darkness, the last thing he was aware of was not the threat of death, but the strange, bewildering sensation of being safe. He woke to a world of soft sounds and gentle hands. The searing pain in his back had been replaced by a deep, throbbing ache, but it was distant, muted. He was no longer on the hard floor. He was in his own bed, the familiar lumpy mattress, a cradle of impossible comfort. The scent of herbs and something clean, like boiled linen, filled the air. He opened his eyes. A woman was sitting on a stool beside his bed. She was older, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark hair streaked with silver and tied back in a neat braid. She met his gaze with calm, intelligent eyes. This must be Winona, the healer Tashunka had sent for. She was grinding herbs in a small stone bowl, her movements practiced and serene. She saw he was awake and offered a small, reassuring smile. She gestured to his back, then held up a small leather pouch. It was a silent explanation. She had treated him. She had given him something for the pain. Arthur realized with a jolt that the arrows were gone. They had been removed. The thought of the process made a cold sweat break out on his forehead, and he was profoundly grateful he had been unconscious for it. He tried to say thank you, but his throat was dry as dust. Winona seemed to understand. She picked up a cup of water from the small table by his bed and held it to his lips, supporting his head with her free hand. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. Over the next few days, the cabin, once his sanctuary of isolation, became a quiet hub of activity. The Lakota did not leave. They made a small, temporary camp, a respectful distance away, in a copse of cottonwood trees by the creek. They did not intrude, but their presence was a constant, comforting weight on the landscape. It was a guard, he realized. They were protecting him, protecting the man who had protected their chief's son. Winona became his constant caretaker. She cleaned and dressed his wounds daily, her touch firm but gentle. She brewed foul-smelling but effective herbal teas that eased the fever and dulled the pain. They communicated through a simple language of gestures and expressions. He learned that a nod from her was high praise for his healing, a slight frown, a caution against moving too much. In her quiet competence, he found a sense of peace he had not known in years. He was forced to be vulnerable, to accept help, and in that surrender, a part of the hard shell around his heart began to crack. Chaitan was his other regular visitor. The boy would appear at the door each morning, a silent sentinel. At first, he would just stand there, watching. Then, he grew bolder. He started coming inside, sitting on the floor by Arthur's bed, sometimes carving a piece of wood with the small knife Arthur had seen him wield in the ravine, sometimes just watching Winona work. One afternoon, Chaitan brought him a gift. It was a handful of wild berries, tart and sweet, held out in his small, cupped hands. Arthur took them, his own large, clumsy hand brushing the boy's. He ate them one by one, the bright flavor a startling contrast to the bland broth Winona had been feeding him. He met the boy's eyes and managed a small, genuine smile. Chaitan smiled back, a quick, brilliant flash of a grin that transformed his serious face. It was the first time Arthur had seen him smile. It felt like the sun breaking through clouds. The warriors did more than just stand guard. He would hear them outside, the sounds of hammering and quiet work. When he was finally strong enough for Winona to help him to the doorway, he saw what they had done. The section of fence the stray heifer had broken, the very reason he had been out in the ravine, had been meticulously repaired, stronger than before. A small stack of firewood, neatly cut and seasoned, was piled by his door. They were repaying their debt, not with words, but with actions, in a language he understood far better. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Tashunka himself came to the cabin. He entered alone, filling the small room with his commanding presence. Winona and Chaitan respectfully slipped out, leaving the two men alone. Tushunka stood by the bed, looking down at Arthur. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a silence of mutual assessment. Finally, Tushunka spoke, his voice low and resonant. He used a few English words, stitched together with gestures. "You fight," he said, touching his own chest, then pointing at Arthur. "Good heart." He then held up his hand, indicating the 3 arrows his men had recovered after removing them from Arthur's back. He laid them on the blanket beside Arthur. Then he placed something else beside them, a single perfect eagle feather, its tip dyed a deep red, a mark of the highest honor, a symbol of a life debt paid. Arthur looked from the feather to the chief's proud, weathered face. He felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years seeing these people as a faceless threat, a part of the wilderness to be feared. Now, their leader stood in his home, honoring him. The prejudice he had carried, inherited from the fearful chatter of the town, felt like a fool's burden. He reached out and touched the feather, his fingers tracing its delicate structure. "Your son," Arthur said, his voice still rough from disuse. "He is brave." He pointed to his own heart. "He has a good heart." A rare smile touched Tushunka's lips. He understood. He placed a hand on his own chest, then on Arthur's, a gesture of shared fatherhood, of a bond forged in violence and sealed in gratitude. Then, as silently as he had come, he turned and left. The tribe departed the next morning at dawn. Arthur watched from his bed as they broke camp, their movements efficient and graceful. They melted back into the landscape as if they had never been there, leaving behind only the repaired fence, the pile of wood, and the profound silence they had filled. Weeks turned into a month. Arthur slowly regained his strength. The wounds on his back healed into thick, ropey scars, a permanent reminder of the day his life had changed course. He moved with a new deliberation, a stiffness that would likely never leave him, but the hollowness inside him, the vast, empty space left by his grief, had begun to fill. It was no longer an abyss of despair. It was being filled with the memory of unexpected kindness, of a boy's courage and a chief's honor. He started working his land again, but something was different. The silence of the homestead was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. The land, once his adversary, now felt like a partner in his healing. He found he no longer looked at the horizon with fear, but with a sense of anticipation. One cool autumn afternoon, as he was splitting wood, he felt that familiar sensation of being watched. He looked up toward the low ridge that overlooked his property. A lone figure on a pony stood there, a small silhouette against the vast blue sky. It was Chaitan. The boy raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Arthur stopped what he was doing, leaned his axe against the chopping block, and raised his own hand in return. A smile, easy and unburdened, touched his lips. The boy was his guardian, his connection to a world he had never sought to understand. The grief for Martha and his son would always be a part of him, a quiet ache beneath the surface, but it was no longer the whole of him. He was no longer just the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had been given a second chance, not by the people of his own town, but by a people he had been taught to fear. He was Arthur Prescott. He was the man with 3 scars on his back and an eagle feather on his mantelpiece, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not alone. His home was no longer just a cabin on a desolate plot of land. It was a point on a map connected by an invisible thread of honor and respect to a people who rode the wind. And as he picked up his axe and resumed his work, the rhythmic thud of wood splitting sounded less like a chore and more like a heartbeat, strong, steady, and alive.